Boston, and we're going to be in the next one as well. And this exhibit explores the history of redlining, urban policy, systems and structures that really created so many of the crises and structural issues that we are dealing with even now today. And this kind of takes us from a past to present look at that. And then what are we doing to advance fair housing, to advance equity, to build out home ownership in America, rebuild some of the wealth destruction that happened from things like redlining. But I'm going to take you through starting over here and talking about redlining, and then wrap around through our timeline all the way to the end. And if you have any questions, please ask. I'm really love to get questions. And we'll get started if there isn't anything anyone else says. So this map is actually, this is the Bronx, New York, is where we originally launched our exhibit. This is, we've had this exhibit around for about 10 years. It's been in a lot of different cities. And this is a really classic redlining map. So you have the federal government that's issuing, for the first time, a 15-year mortgage or 30-year mortgage. We're really creating the home ownership as part of the American dream for the first time in the middle class. But they really want that opportunity to be just for white families. And so this is the Jim Crow era. You know, the federal government's really explicitly racist. And so they're going to bake into a lot of systems and structures they're creating during the New Deal era ways to cut out people of color from benefiting them. And redlining is really how we do this with home ownership. So these maps are from what's called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was federally initiated. This gets picked up by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. And they are really some of the worst redliners, but these are the best visual maps that we have as a visual example of redlining. And so it's basically a credit score. So this is before you and I would have a credit score. And the federal government's going to give everybody's neighborhood a credit score. And there's only 4 of them. So you're either green, great, definitely lend here. Blue, which is second best. Yellow, they call declining, not very good. Then finally red, hazardous areas. And so huge swaths of cities, and you can see this is Baltimore, 239 different cities. Really ubiquitous across the whole country. Get colored in red and yellow. And this is going to send those neighborhoods on a pathway of decline in this investment. So now it's harder to buy and sell a home, right? Because you don't have availability of FHA mortgages. You're not underwriting. Then it leads out into bank branch locations, insurance rates, business loans. And these neighborhoods go into a pathway of decline for decades and decades. And so by the time you get to 70s, 80s, 90s, right, you're going to see abandoned buildings, empty lots, shuttered businesses, you know, all the hallmarks of a red line neighborhood that we think of today. And that really gets initiated through federal policy, through real estate practice, banking practices. And that answers a question I have, right, which is, well, why do this to a neighborhood, right? Why zone it in such a way you're going to destine it for decline? And the answer is in the map. So if you see D3, D2, B10, these correspond to what are called the area descriptions. And they're the smoking gun, because they're telling you, well, why is this red or green or blue? Here's an area, red area, in the Bronx, and you get down to line C, and it says, a little hard to read, but I'll read it for you. Detrimental influences, Negro infiltration.
Wow.
Okay, so there is no hiding.
Right.
There's no mincing of words. The federal government comes out and says, there are hazardous people in America. And we need to know where are they, or where are they infiltrating, or sometimes they'll say invading, which is language FHA used. And so this is from Baltimore. You get infiltration of Negro. These are the instructions for filling out, which ask they're used through the Works Progress Administration, a lot of out-of-work brokers and out-of-work underwriters to go around and map neighborhoods. And they give them the explicit instruction to look for any threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or lower-grade population. So they're looking particularly at black folks, but also Hispanic families, Asian families, new immigrant families, which included Italian immigrants in this era, Jewish families, some of whom get to become white later on, essentially, on the census forms. But if new immigrants and people of color sounds familiar as to who we're targeting, right, that's who gets targeted. And then this is going to fuel segregation, because a lot of red neighborhoods were actually quite integrated when redlining started. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago Chicago was able to show many integrated neighborhoods before redlining actually had higher property values. But this system becomes self-fulfilling. Now you can't get loans there. So we're going to be monitoring who's infiltrating my neighborhood and what's that going to do to my property value. And a lot of white families are going to compete for these green areas. Well, what gets an area to be green? It's not just to say, yeah, this is for white folks, but also say, here are places with restrictions on hazardous infiltration. So you have deeds and covenants and homes that say you can't sell this house to a black family or an Asian family or an immigrant family. And the federal government says that's good. We want to see those kinds of restrictions because that's how you protect property value. And so a lot of the areas that cities are heterogeneous. So a lot of cities are going to be red, yellow, and new development is going to get this green rating. So this is going to spur the construction of American suburbia. Because it's kind of wall themselves off to say we're going to be like home. So this produces a geography we've seen across the country in many, many places, which is concentrated in areas of poverty in cities mostly people of color, much whiter, much wealthier suburbs that surround them. And that basic geography, which lasted many, many decades, really gets set up through redlining. And even today where you see things like gentrification, where you see money starting to flood back into many redline neighborhoods, often for the first time since they're redlined. That's not benefiting the families and the people that were affected by redlining quite often because they never got access to these homeownership systems, right? So now the rising tide, if it is, right, is washing people away. In a lot of redline areas, because they're artificially devalued real estate, right? They shouldn't be this low, but they're redlined. That primes them for speculation. And while that type of crisis is happening on the one hand, where you have predatory practices against that, on a lot of green areas that were meant to be exclusive, and exclusivity was all about maintaining property value, haven't built enough new and affordable housing for quite a long time, and we now have a housing shortage in many, many places around the country that's leading to a crisis of affordability, particularly for starter homes and first-time home buyers. So now it's, what in the era when redlining starts, even if you look at the average square footage of a typical first-built, new-build home has like tripled or quadrupled, right? So the availability of new and affordable housing for starter homes for families is just so much less than it was in many, many markets than, right after World War II. When this was a huge mechanism for upward mobility, they got into upward mobility, and now it's become a big barrier for many families who just can't get over that hump into now very expensive homes. So this really sets up so many of the crises that we see today in the housing market. You see a lot of displacement in cities now because of gentrification, and on the other hand, you see not enough new and affordable housing for first-time home buyers in many markets around the country. You can tie this all into policy decisions that we made as a country a long time ago. So this, talks about the maps. I want to move on a little bit to this timeline, which I really think of as the centerpiece of this. It takes us through. Obviously, a lot happened much well before redlining and up until now, and a lot of examples of people pushing back against this, of creating new alternative visions. You dial back here, you have things like Black Wall Street, if you guys have heard that, black banking industry that was nationwide. But the black banking industry, which was actually building a lot of wealth around the country, got really hardly hit, like many banking industries did during the Great Depression. But the federal government didn't bail them out the way they did a lot of other banks, and they were banking in what became redline neighborhoods. So that industry actually went into decline in many ways because of it. And there were a lot of upwardly mobile families. There was a lot of black GI families, new immigrant families, who really would have joined the middle class had it not been for redlining and policies like it. It prevented them from buying and building wealth, or many families who did own homes who didn't see that home accrue value but saw that actually lose their money on the home and go underwater. And so this really created a fork in the road for so many families.
You can get up here if you need to.
And then you get things like urban renewal and slum clearance, where we start to say as a country, we have these slums. We We don't know why, right? Well, the answer is we need to bulldoze these neighborhoods. So throughout the country, we start doing slum clearance, where huge swaths of cities get knocked down. All these people, many of which were owners, you had tons of small businesses as well, just displaced. And they often, they give you eminent domain, they pay you a little bit of money, there's never enough money to go and buy that. So people went from home ownership to rentals. And that also built things like highways for neighborhoods. And that created huge waves of disinvestment and displacement. It accelerated the decline of many, many urban neighborhoods. And then you get this era of urban decay. You have, because of redlining, it doesn't just affect a few isolated neighborhoods, but whole cities where the tax base is leaving, right? The property values are declining and the property tax is declining. Cities start hemorrhaging cash and they don't have enough to make their budgets. And so they come up with things called a policy called land shrinkage, which actually started in New York City. It happened in Detroit recently, and formally all over the country, where they said, look, we don't have enough money anymore because we don't have property taxes anymore. So we need to identify areas that are dying, read redline, and areas that are healthy. And we're going to cut off and sacrifice those dying neighborhoods to save money for the healthy neighborhoods. And so many neighborhoods, they cut off trash pickup, street maintenance, schools, libraries, parks. But people are still living in these neighborhoods. And the very first thing they cut in New York City, actually, when this policy began, was fire departments. And a lot of these neighborhoods end up burning. And you have places like the South Bronx, where we first launched this exhibit, where 80% of the built environment burned to the ground in about 10 or 15 years. Because landlords burn buildings to get the insurance money out because the property value just completely collapses. Or nobody's fixed the fire hydrant. And so a fire on the block, ends up burning multiple buildings. And so this creates this huge, traumatic and destructive event for so many communities. And that leads to, just an enormous human toll. Families are getting moved around and constantly displaced. Communities that used to be really tight-knit and strong are getting pulled apart. There's massive unemployment because fires abandon it. And you get a series of epidemics. You get, epidemic unemployment, as I said. You get the heroin epidemic in this era. We've been going through the opioid epidemic, which you hear about as a public health crisis. Well, not so in the 70s, when we're going to talk about the heroin epidemic as a criminal crisis. And that leads into, the crack epidemic, you get a violence epidemic. And this moment when you have, people saying, well, we're in a major, major crisis. And you get on the one hand from the ground up a lot of community advocacy, getting things like the Community Reinvestment Act, it's forcing banks to lend back into neighborhoods that were redlined, community organizing, faith-based organizations that start. I was just talking to someone about Nehemiah Homes, if you're familiar with that, in Fountain, Brooklyn, where they created affordable ownership opportunities for families. And 30% of their first tranche of buyers came straight from public housing to buy their first home. And they had 0 foreclosures for 30 years.
That's good.
You have these amazing models that show up where people are like, you know what, we're in a crisis. And the answer is let's reinvest in Let's reinvest in our neighborhoods. Let's rebuild the wealth without destroying redlining. But then you have a very different response coming from the top down, but really across the political spectrum of cracking down. So you get things like broken windows policing and sort of zero tolerance and really this idea that we need to clean up our neighborhoods. And my question would be, why are the windows broken, right? Well, we're not going to say, the windows are broken because there's huge history that goes back to redlining, and that's what broken windows are. It's criminals and drug dealers and vandals, and by cracking down on them, we'll bring our neighborhoods back to normal. And so that really leads us into where we are today, where you have things like mass incarceration, policing becoming huge issues, and investments trying to pour back into redline neighborhoods, often for the first time since the redline. But because of this huge structural history, right, as we were saying earlier, the people who've been on the front lines are not the beneficiaries of that very risk. And so the question, we kind of lead off here with, what are we doing to really heal and repair this history? It's not enough just to say, okay, we've stopped doing redlining, we've stopped, these practices, many of which do continue. But how do we really undo
it's okay. Caught me all the way.
But also look at really how
I can't really hear him. No.
getting people into
With the mic.
homeownership. We actually work with a lot of fair housing legislation, down payment assistance grants for families that are affected by redlining, building,
He's about to go over there, but I don't want to block anybody else.
reinvesting in communities. All of these things are really important. And at the same time, we've been doing that, working with a lot of municipalities. We just had this in New York City, City Hall, for this city of Yes, which is building new and affordable houses, really increasing housing in areas that have maintained that exclusivity and trying to keep doing affordable housing. One of the things that we talk about here is, we had this sort of outside
I can't hear y'all, so I'm going to try to squeeze up. Oh, sorry. Okay. I just can't hear.
housing, but also a lot of the places that have the highest real estate value now are not these isolated bedroom communities, but actually places that are walkable, shops, culture, restaurants. That's why you see gentrification, right? And so it's sort of and where this is kind of value by subtraction, this is value by addition. We want, a lot more going on, thriving communities, places where we can connect with our neighbors. And this is a study, and this is just one of many. You fight that kind of NIMBY attitude of I don't want new and affordable housing near me because there's a mentality that means lower property values. But actually, so many studies have shown, this is just one, showing that single-family homes in a half-mile radius of new apartment buildings were appreciating at higher rates than single-family homes further away. And that's because, this is actually increasing the value of the neighborhood to have new and affordable. So, creating new main streets in suburban areas, places that are walkable, places that are more dense, that allow for a diversity is actually increasing the value of homes nearby. And so this is an important part of just kind of pushing into a future that where everyone can thrive together versus either or, right? So I'm going to leave my presentation there before. I know there may be a lot of questions. I'm happy to answer them. I'd love to hear them. I'd also like to encourage you to see some folks that have been writing. We have some postings and cards in there. Reflections, your thoughts, your personal stories. And we have a booth where we're recording that. So we really want to encourage everyone, if you have a story or a reflection, if you just want to say something, you can record it in the booth. We actually have an app, and there are QR codes on that side of that booth, and you can just record it on your phone using an account. So that is something that we'd really love to share with NAR, to keep the story going and to share your experiences. And please ask me any questions. And get a donut. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.